In 1912, the Baguio police were ordered to perform a task that defied the logic of modern science. They were sent to exhume a grave under a suffocating mountain fog, expecting to find a body claimed by the earth. But when the flicker of their lantern hit the face of William Billy Price, they didn't see a skeleton. They saw a man who looked like he had died just 5 minutes ago. This is not a legend. It is a documented forensic impossibility from the Philippine Historical Archives. Price's skin was intact, his features were sharp, and his hair was perfectly groomed. To the investigators staring into that casket, it made no sense, because according to the official records, Billy Price had been buried in that damp soil for 6 months.
To understand how a titan of industry ended up in a mahogany box, perfectly preserved and saturated with enough poison to kill 20 men, we have to look inside the walls of the finest estate in Baguio. And we have to look at the love that was slowly turning him into stone. The mist in Baguio doesn't just sit on the hills, it behaves like a living thing. In 1912, it was thicker than usual, a cold gray shroud that crawled through the pine trees and pressed its face against the window panes of the grandest mansions on the ridge. At the center of it all stood the Price Estate, a fortress of American timber and stone, built by a man who believed he was invincible. William Billy Price didn't just live in Baguio, he built it. His trucks moved the very earth that leveled the roads. He was a titan of the Cordilleras, a man of iron constitution who had survived revolutions, the heat of the lowlands, and the cutthroat politics of the colonial era. But by December, the iron had turned to glass.
The story truly begins not with a death, but with a sound. It was the sound of a shovel striking the frozen earth of the Baguio cemetery in the dead of night. 4 men stood around a fresh grave. There were no mourners, only the city health officer, a silent constable, and 2 laborers with mud-caked boots. They weren't there for a ritual. They were there for a forensic necessity. Rumors had been rotting the social circles of Manila for months, whispers that if you opened the casket, you wouldn't find a man who died of natural causes. You would find a crime scene. As the laborers heaved the mahogany lid open, the constable stepped back, covering his nose with a silk handkerchief. But it wasn't the smell of death that hit them. It was a sharp, biting scent, metallic, like garlic and burnt copper. The health officer leaned in, his lantern swinging low. The light hit Billy's face, and he gasped. Billy Price had been dead for 6 months, yet his skin looked like parchment stretched over a drum. He hadn't decayed naturally. He'd been preserved, mummified by the very substance that had killed him.
To understand how a giant like Billy ended up in a hole in the mud smelling of garlic and copper, we have to go back to the month the trucks stopped moving. In October, Billy Price was at the peak of his power. His company was finalizing a massive government contract to move equipment into the northern mines. But the man who arrived at the office that Monday morning wasn't the Billy the staff knew. He was pale. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate a surveyor's transit, were shaking so violently he couldn't hold his coffee cup. "The water," he whispered to his head clerk, a man named Elias. "It tastes like I'm sucking on a copper coin, Elias. Everything, the coffee, the soup, the water, it all tastes of metal." Elias looked at his boss and felt a cold shiver. Behind Billy's eyes, there was a flicker of animal terror. Billy wasn't just sick, he felt hunted. The suspicion didn't fall on the house first, it fell on the garage.
A week prior, Billy had fired a lead mechanic named Tomas, a man who knew every inch of the Price trucking fleet. Tomas had been caught siphoning fuel and had left the estate screaming that the mountains would swallow Billy whole. When Billy fell ill, everyone's eyes turned toward the same man. It was a simple, brutal explanation that everyone in town was ready to believe. A disgruntled worker, a bottle of industrial solvent, and a vengeful heart. It was a safe explanation. But as Billy retreated into the master bedroom of his mansion, the metallic taste followed him. He stopped eating the food prepared by the house staff. He stopped drinking the water from the estate's well. He became a prisoner in his own home, convinced that Tomas, or one of his associates, had poisoned the very foundations of the house. He didn't realize that the threat wasn't coming from the garage. It wasn't coming from a fired mechanic. It was sitting right beside him on the nightstand, in a bottle of healing tonic delivered every morning with a soft, steady hand. Billy lay in the dark, watching the pine trees sway through the fog, listening to the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his own heart. He didn't know that every beat was pushing a lethal concentration of arsenic deeper into his marrow. And he didn't know that the person holding his hand in the dark was the one who had already signed his death warrant.
By the second week of November, Billy's world had shrunk to the four walls of the master suite. The grand, sweeping views of the Cordillera Mountains, once his pride, now felt like a taunt. Outside, the world was moving. His trucks were hauling, his workers were building, but inside, time had begun to thicken and rot. Billy lay under 3 layers of wool blankets, yet he was shivering so violently the bed frame rattled against the floorboards. His skin, once bronzed by years of mountain sun, had taken on a terrifying waxy pallor. But if you looked closely at his hands, you'd see something even stranger. Dark, irregular patches, like drops of ink soaking into parchment, were appearing on his palms and the soles of his feet. He began to describe a sensation that no doctor could explain. He said it felt as if 1,000 needles were being driven into his fingertips, followed by a cold, numbing fire that crawled up his shins. He couldn't even stand the weight of a bedsheet on his legs. The mere touch felt like a physical blow.
One evening, a thick, suffocating fog rolled off the ridges and swallowed the estate whole. Elias, the clerk, was staying in the guest quarters down the hall, unable to leave because the visibility on the mountain roads had dropped to 0. Around midnight, he heard it, a sharp, metallic clink coming from the direction of the garage. He grabbed a lantern and stepped out onto the veranda. The air was so cold it stung his lungs, but through the swirling gray mist, he saw a shadow. A man, crouched near the fuel drums, holding something heavy. When the lantern light caught the figure, the man bolted, disappearing into the pines. The next morning, the staff found a half-empty bottle of industrial degreaser sitting on Billy's workbench. It hadn't been there the day before. The word Tomas was whispered through the kitchen like a prayer. The mechanic had been seen. He was circling. He was waiting. Inside the house, Adeline was a blur of silent, graceful motion. She moved like a shadow, her footsteps never making a sound on the polished Nara wood floors. She had dismissed most of the servants, claiming that the noise of the cleaning was shattering Billy's nerves. She took over every task herself. She brewed the tea. She prepared the broths. And every 4 hours, like clockwork, she reached for the small, blue-tinted bottle on the vanity. "It's for the pain, Billy," she would whisper, her voice a soft, steady hum in the dark room. "The doctor said this is the only thing that will calm the fire." Billy would open his mouth, his eyes rolling back in his head, and swallow. He trusted her more than he trusted his own senses. He had to. He was a man who had built a kingdom, and now he couldn't even lift a spoon to his own lips. But Elias began to notice something. He was the one who handled the estate's ledger, and the numbers were starting to scream. Huge sums of money were being moved out of the Price trucking accounts, not into the mine contracts, but into private holding companies in Manila. he found a red-stamped manifest hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, a document that detailed a shipment of heavy machinery that had been signed for by Billy's company but had never arrived at any mine. Elias walked into the master bedroom to show Billy the paper, to tell him that someone was using the company for a front for something dark. But as he approached the bed, he stopped. The smell in the room was overwhelming. It wasn't the smell of a sick room. It was that sharp, unmistakable scent of garlic, so strong it made Elias's eyes water. Billy was staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow and ragged. His hair, once thick and silver, was falling out in clumps on the pillowcase. Adeline was sitting in the corner, her back to the door, brushing her hair with rhythmic, hypnotic strokes. Stroke, stroke, stroke. "He's resting, Elias," she said, without turning around. Her voice was cold, as if it had been carved from the mountain ice. "He doesn't want to see any more papers. He just wants the taste of the metal to go away." Elias looked at the red-stamped manifest in his hand, then at the skeletal remains of the man who had been his mentor. He realized then that the shadow he had seen in the garage, the shadow they all thought was Tomas, wasn't the one Billy should be afraid of. Tomas was a man who used a wrench, but the person in this room was using something much patienter, something that didn't leave a bruise. As Elias backed out of the room, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw Adeline pick up the blue-tinted bottle. She didn't look at the label. She didn't have to. She knew exactly how many drops it took to keep the silence in the mansion absolute. Elias couldn't stay in that mansion a moment longer. The air felt heavy, as if the very oxygen was being replaced by that cloying, garlicky vapor. He slipped out of the side entrance, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel, and headed straight for the company's main garage. He wasn't looking for Tomas anymore. He was looking for the truth. Inside the quiet office of Price Trucking, Elias began to tear through the secondary ledgers, the ones Billy kept in a locked floor safe. He found the red-stamped manifests again, but this time he cross-referenced the dates with the fuel logs. That's when the world shifted beneath his feet. The logs showed that on the nights Billy's trucks were supposedly idling due to the mountain storms, they were actually consuming hundreds of gallons of fuel. They weren't going to the northern mines. They were heading west, toward the coast, a path that bypassed every colonial checkpoint in the province. Then Elias found it. Tucked into the binding of the 1912 ledger was a single, hand-drawn map of the Baguio-Bawang Road. There were marks at specific intervals, hidden caves and private docks. This wasn't a construction logistics plan. It was a smuggling blueprint. Billy Price, the titan of Baguio, had unknowingly built the infrastructure for a massive gold smuggling syndicate. His trucks were moving unrefined ore out of the Benguet Mountains and straight onto unmarked ships headed for the China Sea. And the person signing these safe passage orders while Billy lay dying, it wasn't Billy. It was a signature that looked like his, but the ink was too fresh, the loops too deliberate. It was Adeline. Elias realized that Billy hadn't just fallen ill. He had discovered the shadow business running inside his own company. He had likely confronted Adeline, or perhaps he had threatened to take the red-stamped papers to the Governor General. In that moment, Billy stopped being a husband and started being a liability. Back at the mansion, the silence had become absolute. The wind had died down, leaving the house trapped in a pocket of freezing, stagnant air. Elias returned, creeping up the back stairs, intending to grab Billy and drag him to the hospital in the lowlands, consequences be damned. He pushed open the master bedroom door. The lantern on the nightstand was turned down so low it was just a dying orange ember. "Billy?" Elias whispered. A hand, thin as a bird's claw,
reached out from the tangle of wool blankets. Billy's fingernails were the first thing Elias saw in the dim light. They were no longer clear. A series of vivid white horizontal lines, later known to forensics as Mees lines, had appeared across every single nail. It was the body's final desperate record of every dose of poison he had swallowed.
Billy's eyes snapped open. For the first time in weeks, the fog of the drugs seemed to lift, replaced by a crystalline, terrifying lucidity. He grabbed Elias's sleeve, pulling him close. His breath smelled of metal and decay. "The tonic, Elias," Billy rasped, his voice a dry rattle. Don't let her. The signature." He tried to say more, but a violent spasm racked his frame, his muscles locking in a permanent, agonizing contraction. This wasn't the peaceful passing of a sick man. This was the violent chemical shutdown of a human nervous system. At the foot of the bed, a shadow moved. Adeline was standing there, perfectly still. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding the blue-tinted bottle and a fountain pen. "He's just agitated, Elias," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any heat. "The fever makes them say the strangest things before the end. You should go back to your quarters. There is nothing left for a clerk to do here." Elias looked at the pen in her hand, then at the dying man who had built a city. He saw the red-stamped manifest sitting on the vanity, waiting for one final forged signature to authorize the largest gold shipment in the history of the colony. Billy Price gave one final shuddering breath and went still. The metallic taste was finally gone. Elias didn't wait for Adeline to look at him again. He ran out of the room, out of the house, and ran into the Baguio night. He didn't go to the local police. Half of them were on the Price trucking payroll. He ran until his lungs burned, heading for the only person who could authorize an exhumation, the American commissioner in Manila. He left Billy behind in that gilded cage, a man who had been mummified while he was still alive, surrounded by the gold he never knew he was stealing.
The laborers in the Baguio cemetery didn't speak as they reached the 6-foot mark. The only sound was the rhythmic thwack of damp earth hitting the grass and the distant, lonely howl of the mountain wind. When the shovels finally struck the heavy mahogany of the casket, the sound was dull, a final heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of their boots. They expected the worst. They expected the sight of a man who had spent 6 months being reclaimed by the mountain soil. But as the lid was pried back, the 4 men standing around the grave didn't turn away in disgust. They froze in pure, paralyzed confusion. Billy Price was staring back at them. His eyes were sunken, yes, but his skin wasn't gone. It had turned into a hard, waxy leather, preserving his features in a state of permanent crystalline terror. He looked less like a corpse and more like a statue carved from amber. The high-dose arsenic hadn't just killed him, it had acted as a chemical preservative, mummifying him from the inside out. He was a walking crime scene that had refused to rot. The city health officer reached into the casket with a pair of forceps. He touched a lock of Billy's hair. It didn't just fall out, it slid away in a single, oily clump. When the lab results came back a few days later, they didn't find the arsenic in his stomach. They found it everywhere. It was embedded in the deep tissue of his liver, it was in the marrow of his bones, and it was concentrated in the very roots of his hair. That night, the constables didn't go to the mansion to talk, they went to finish it. The Price estate sat at the end of the ridge, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. The gate was unlocked, swinging back and forth with a low, metallic groan. When they pushed open the front doors, the house was a tomb. The furniture was still there, the Nara floors were still polished, but the life had been sucked out of the rooms.
They headed straight for the master bedroom. The blue-tinted bottle was gone. The vanity was bare. Adeline hadn't waited for the results of the exhumation. The moment she heard the sound of the first shovel hitting the dirt at the cemetery, she had walked out the back door and vanished into the Baguio fog. But in her haste to disappear, she had forgotten the one thing that would bridge the gap between a sick husband and a cold-blooded execution. In the back of the walk-in closet, behind a loose floorboard near the radiator, a young constable found a small black ledger. He opened it, expecting to find business accounts or trucking logs. Instead, he saw a series of dates written in Adeline's perfect, elegant handwriting. October 18, 3 drops in the morning coffee. He complained of a headache. I told him it was the altitude. October 29, 5 drops in the hair tonic. He is starting to lose the feeling in his feet. He asked for the doctor. I told him the roads were closed. November 12, 7 drops. He can no longer hold a pen. The manifests are ready. Beside the ledger was a red-stamped envelope, already sealed. It was addressed to a private box in Manila. The understanding taste Billy complained about wasn't an illness. It was the flavor of his own betrayal, measured out in drops by the woman who sat by his bed and whispered that he was safe.
Adeline Price was never seen in Baguio again. Some say she made it to the coast and boarded a tramp steamer under a different name. Others say the syndicate she served realized she was a liability and liquidated her the same way she had liquidated Billy. But the story doesn't end with her disappearance. The locals who live near the old Price Ridge still tell a story about the fog. They say that if you're walking the trails near the estate at 3 a.m., the air will suddenly turn cold, colder than the mountain should be. And for a brief moment, you won't smell the pine trees or the mountain rain. You'll smell something sharp and biting, something like garlic and burnt copper. And if you look up at the dark windows of the master suite, you might see a single dim orange light. It's the glow of a lantern on a nightstand where a man is still lying in the dark, wondering why his tea tastes of metal and why his wife is smiling as she strokes his hair. The Arsenic Estate wasn't just a house. It was a ledger of a crime that the earth of Baguio refused to swallow. Billy Price was a man who built a city, but in the end, the city watched him become a mummy in a silk-lined box, a permanent witness to the one secret that Adeline couldn't bury. The archive is closed, for now.